2019 special public meeting of the Cincinnati Board of Education. We welcome everyone and request everyone in the audience to please silence your cell phones and electronic devices. Please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates?
Present.
Ms. Bolton?
Present.
Mrs. Bowers? Present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Messer?
Present.
Mr. Morosky? President Jones?
Here. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today for this hearing, and hello to those who are watching us live online. We are here for a critical conversation because our district and our city are at a pivotal point of resurgence and growth. Cincinnati Public Schools is committed to playing our part to make Cincinnati a destination city. The health of the city is directly linked to the health of our public schools and vice versa. One can't be successful without the success of the other. CPS is growing. We have 4,400 more students in the last 5 years alone. We have to be smart and intentional about how we plan for the future, including our sources of income. That's why the board has initiated a strategic planning process, a plan we will roll out later this year. A critical aspect of our long-range financial planning is support of local property taxes. Our existing agreement with the City of Cincinnati, referred to as the 1999 Tax Abatement Agreement, expires at the end of this year. The city has used tax abatements for community reinvestment, tax increment financing, and other abatements as a means to retain and attract development throughout the city. Under the existing agreement, in addition to the percentage of taxes the district receives, the city annually provides the school district with a $5 million payment. Under the original agreement, the city agreed to pay for school nurses and school crossing guards, but about a decade ago, in the tough economic times of the Great Recession, the city stopped paying for nurses and guards, and CPS assumed that financial responsibility. As this board considers whether or not to enter into a new version of this agreement, there are many factors we have to examine, including keeping in mind our property taxpayers who financially support our schools through their taxes. Those taxpayers are our parents, but a large percentage are not parents and yet continue to support this district because they believe we are headed in the right direction. It is our obligation and responsibility to ensure the long-term financial stability of this school district, the largest school district and 16th largest employer in our region. That's what brings us here today, to have a public and transparent conversation about the future of this district and the future of this city. We have asked representatives of the city to present today, but they were unable to do so. City Manager Patrick Duhaney sent a letter to our superintendent yesterday, and all members should have that letter. At an appropriate time, we will also invite members of the economic development community to provide insight and input on how tax abatements impact them. We will start tonight with an overview presentation from our Treasurer and CFO, Jennifer Wagner, and our General Counsel, Daniel Hoyne. We will then hear a brief presentation from Michelle Dillingham, representing the Community Education Justice Coalition. After that, we want to hear from the public. And one of the things that we decided, I mean, typically what we do in our hearing of the public is each speaker has 3 minutes. And we will recognize that, and each speaker will have 3 minutes. But I think it also might benefit us if people in the audience who don't necessarily have a 3-minute spiel have questions, specific questions that they want to address. We will try to address those questions. If we are not able to address your questions, we intend to document the questions, research and find answers and responses, and then we will post it for community-wide view online. So we're going to begin our presentation with Mr. Hoyne.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I will keep my portion very brief, in part because I've shared this with the board once already, also with the audit committee, and because I'm sure you're more interested in hearing from some of the members of the public who are here today. I do want to make sure or introduce the team that's been working on this from CPS, and of course the treasurer and I, Brittany Triola, who recently took a new treasurer's position with Granville School District, so that's outstanding. Nathan Tyaher is in our accounts receivable department. Dave DeMuzio is our outside counsel for Board of Revision matters, and also Ken Dietz, who's a consultant to the district. And I'll give the same disclaimer that any mistakes in this presentation should be attributed to me and not the very capable members of the team. Very quickly, just again, to give some legal background on abatements, there are any number of abatements, exemptions, TIFs, and other tax incentives that apply to real estate and that are available under the Ohio Revised Code. This is a non-exhaustive list, but certainly there's a whole slew of abatements that are described in the Ohio Revised Code. The ones that we see most routinely are community reinvestment area agreements and TIFs. But those are not the only forms of abatement available under the Ohio Revised Code. It's also true, and I pointed this out the last time we talked, that the school district, because they're directly impacted by real estate tax abatement, because our revenues, or at least our local share, comes in large part from real estate taxes, the school district's approval is required for many of these types of abatements and exemptions, but not for all. In general, the abatements that are available to real estate developers and for the city to use to encourage economic development require the school district's approval, or that they can be offered without the school district's approval for a lesser amount for a shorter term. So, in some cases, the school district's approval is required, and in some cases, it's not. If the school district does not approve, there's certain procedural requirements that the city would have to take, giving notice to the school district, an opportunity to object in many cases, as well as under 5709.82, in some cases, if the income taxes, if the income that is generated from these new incentivized projects exceeds a certain threshold, $1 million of new income, there's a requirement that the city repay the school district 50% of those new income taxes that were generated. It's to prevent the city from incentivizing by abating real estate taxes, something that affects the school district, in an effort to really generate a lot of new income that might have a benefit for them for new income taxes. Again, we talked about the 99 agreement, which is our agreement with the city and the city of Cincinnati. It arose out of again, at the same time that there was this sales tax that was generated for the construction of the stadiums. The county agreed to reimburse the district for the properties along the river that would be tax exempt, and there's a county agreement that we have. The city also agreed to contribute $5 million a year that would be contributed to the school district for new capital projects. And when the 99 agreement was written, it was determined that that $5 million represented the difference. The school district agreed as a part of that agreement to allow the city to use these economic incentives, these abatements and TIFs, and that $5 million would represent the difference between what the school district should have received in tax revenues, new tax revenues, and what it did receive from the pilot payments. So the kind of major terms, and I'm going to skip one slide ahead, of this 99 agreement are annual $5 million payments, a 20-year term that expires December 31, 2019, that we waive and give the city the authority to approve new tax exemptions, credits, abatements, on the condition that for new CRAs, the developer pays the school district 25% in a payment in lieu of taxes, or 27% on new TIFs. And then we waive the notice, we waive the income tax reconciliation, and we waive our right to approve those agreements. An important point, however, though, and something that's referenced right in the 99 agreement, is that $5 million payment is supposed to represent, again, the difference between that 25% pilot payment does not make us whole. There's a recognition between the parties that a 25% pilot is not going to make us whole. And so the city agreed to make annual $5 million payments, and this is quoting from the agreement. The payments here under being the annual $5 million payments are made as compensation to the board as authorized by statute for additional property tax revenues that the board would have received if the city had not authorized tax exemptions. So again, there's a whole reconciliation process, and this $5 million is intended to make the school district whole. Financially, the real question is whether or not how CPS has done under this agreement, and trying to look at whether or not by entering into this agreement the school district has ended up ahead or behind. To analyze that, you have to understand that there's two types of levies that CPS has out there, two types of levies. One would be a fixed rate levy, one is a fixed sum levy. A fixed sum levy is an emergency levy. Under a fixed sum levy, the school district receives a set amount of money. So asks the voters to approve that every year the school district will receive a fixed sum. And then the auditor each year recalculates the millage on property taxes to generate that fixed sum amount. We're going to get that regardless of the taxpayers who are abated or not abated. The auditor will recalculate the millage to generate that fixed sum. Where we lose on abatements and exemptions is fixed rate levies. So that's where we set a fixed millage that's going to be charged against all the property in the school district. And when there's properties that are abated, exempted, TIFed, that's where CPS loses revenues. And so this is a summary of our fixed sum levies and our fixed rate levies. Again, I'm looking, when we're trying to determine what would make us whole, what we look at is our fixed rate levies. And for tax year 2008, that amount was 31.94 mils. 31.94 mils, the fixed rate levy portion of a property tax, of a property owner's total tax bill represents 33% of that total tax bill. So in order for CPS to be made whole, at least for tax year 2018, the school district believes that 33% is the percentage that we would need to be reimbursed. This chart summarizes essentially how we've done over the last 6 years. The column 2 represents the estimated TIF values that in those tax years. Column 3 is the CRA values. You combine those two totals for the total abated property for those tax years, and then you see what we lost in foregone taxes on that property. Column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the total pilots is the amount we received in payments, those 25% payments from developers, and you can see that does not make us whole. There's an estimated net impact in the last column that shows the shortfall, but recall, we also receive a $5 million payment from the city to make that up. And so you can see in some years the school district has come out ahead, in some years it's come out behind. It's been a fair estimate of the amount of lost tax revenues for us on our fixed rate levies. This is a slide that Jen has used to show. Do you want to discuss this slide?
Yes, but before I do that, I just want to remind back on the slide previous to that, that in addition to that negative in there, we were also paying the city nurses and crossing guards, which are up close to $2 million now in total a year. And so that when you add that, it doesn't always make us positive. Okay, so if you flip to the next slide. So what I'm trying to show is the impact of the fixed sum levy and when a property goes onto the tax roll. So if you take an estimate of $1 million property, the assessed value or the taxable value is 35% of that $1 million at $350,000. So under the agreement, we would have received $8,445 under the formula under the agreement per year. And then when it rolls onto the tax duplicate, assuming that it's still at $1 million, we would only receive an increase of $2,700 per year because we will only get the fixed rate portion of that millage. So I'm just trying to show the math because there was a lot of misinformation from people who don't always understand the complexity of school finance, that we wouldn't get the entire millage that's due to the district based on these property values coming onto the tax rolls.
Okay. The next thing we discussed, that one of the things that the city has said, and actually said in City Manager Dehaney's most recent letter, is that the school district also benefits from the change to the state foundation funding. In our view, the make whole calculation, that the amount determined to make the school district whole, does not and should not include state funding. For one, the amount of state funding that the school district receives every year is not within either party's control. It's not within CPS's control. It's not within the city's control. It can change and has changed and likely will change again. It's speculative to say that the school district, that to base that make whole calculation on the amount that CPS receives in state foundation funding.
Dan, let me just jump in one
Please.
second. So many people don't know that under the state foundation formula, the wealth index calculation is relative to how the rest of the state is performing. So if another district in the state gets incredibly poor because of something that happens in their district, we could become much richer with nothing in our economics changing. It's all a relative calculation, so it makes even their assumption on using state foundation formula even more difficult to calculate and to rely on, not to mention the state foundation formula has been ruled unconstitutional 4 times.
In addition, it's also, I think, important to note that the school district is not compensated for all types of abatements. So, for example, residential abatements for which the school district does not have approval rights under the Ohio Revised Code are not reimbursed in any way to the school district. And so in 2018, 17, and 16, this chart shows our estimate of the foregone taxes related to residential CRA abated properties. So we're losing, in 2018, $7.5 million alone. Again, that's not included in our calculation of, and never has been included by the city in what amount would make the school district whole. So based on that, we came to you with, actually we changed the language, I think, from recommendations to considerations for negotiations at Board Member Bolton's advice. But our primary consideration is that the school district should be made whole, and it's as simple as that. It's not any more complex than that. Our thought in going into these negotiations is that instead of trying to predict 20 years down the road what would make the school district whole, that we should be reimbursed every year based on the fixed rate millage that the school district has out there. And that can be recalculated every year to determine what an appropriate percentage would be to pay back the school district in pilot payments, and that would make us whole. Our sort of fundamental premise is not any more complicated than that. Some more specific sort of considerations is to reduce the term of the agreement. We think 20 years is a really long time to try to predict both state foundation, just everything. We believe we should have a much shorter term. We, again, think that you should recalculate that reimbursement rate every year instead of trying to pick or predict what an appropriate reimbursement rate would be. We recommend avoiding the in-kind elements to reimbursement that were in the original 99 agreement. As has been pointed out, the city did not fulfill its promise to pay the cost of the nurses or the crossing guards, and so the school district has taken those on. But in general, we think that those in-kind elements are difficult to value and not necessarily the best way to be reimbursed. We think this should be, we should avoid that. It's important that the agreements that are currently out there and that continue to be approved by the city are premised on the school district receiving, in addition, that $5 million payment. The city has said, and I think been pretty open about, that they would like to discontinue those annual payments of $5 million. And in our view, that may be okay, provided the school district is getting that full make-whole amount, and the agreements that already are approved and will continue in some cases, again, were premised on a 25% reimbursement plus the $5 million. So there's got to be an accounting for the agreements that will continue and that were premised on the school district receiving an annual payment from the city. We think and believe we should be reimbursed for administrative costs. And finally, we think that there should be no extensions or amendments of CRAs without CPS approval. The last thing, and I'll be very brief on this, is we did receive a letter from the city manager yesterday. We have not had a significant amount of time to analyze that, but it's been shared with our financial experts as well as our legal experts. I had a few initial kind of considerations or reactions to that letter. And I always try to look for points of agreement. To me, points of agreement are important. So one of the statements that the city manager made is that continued economic growth is critical to a healthy and thriving city and school system. Absolutely, at least I think we agree with that. We also think sort of the correlative of that is that continued success of the school district has a direct and positive correlation on the city's continued economic growth. So a high-performing school district, of course, drives up real estate values, and a well-educated workforce is needed to drive that economic growth. So while we agree, the correlative is also true. One of the statements that the city manager leads with is that the city is comfortable with or without an agreement. I don't know whether that's true or not. I really don't. It's CPS's impression, I think, that the 99 agreement provides some important incentives to the city and that the city has used to attract new development. But here's the key. Nothing in the 99 agreement requires the city to be offering these incentives or abatements. It's not as if the 99 agreement requires that. And yet, what we're seeing is really a proliferation of those agreements being used. And so, you know, again, if it's not, I don't know whether the city believes that offering those full abatements is necessary or not, but they're offering them and at an increasingly rapid pace. It's also true, as the city manager points out, that the city has the ability to offer certain incentives unilaterally, and we've acknowledged that on our first slide. Again, those are more limited, both in percentage of the abatement and the duration, the length, or the term of the abatements. Without the school without the school district's approval, the city would be subject to additional administrative requirements such as notice and possible repayment of income taxes. So again, I don't know whether the city believes that it needs this agreement or not, but they are using it intensively, especially in the last several years. Again, looking for points of agreement. The city manager uses an example of $1 million in abated property values and uses the exact same fixed rate millage to calculate what the loss to revenue to CPS is. So he uses 11,200. If you remember Jen's slide earlier, which I can jump back to very quickly, our calculation was 11,179. So we're in agreement in terms of the loss of revenue to CPS from an abatement. We're also in agreement in terms of what the 25% pilot makes up. So the city manager says in his letter that's about $8,500, and we calculate that to be $8,445. So we're talking the same numbers through that analysis. And I think, as Jen points out right here, the $8,500 and the 25% pilot does not make us whole. And I think there's agreement from the city on that. Where we differ, I think, let me get back to here. Where we differ is that the city manager's analysis is premised on the changes to the state foundation formula. And we have a fundamental difference as to whether that should be included in the make-whole calculation. One sentence, the city manager makes the point that pilots or payments in lieu of taxes create a new local revenue source for CPS. I wouldn't have said it exactly like that. It's not a new local revenue source. It's a revenue that would otherwise be generated, and it's used to offset what we're losing in fixed rate levies. So I wouldn't call it a new revenue source. It's also a condition in our agreement that 25% be paid. So I somewhat disagree with the way he's described that. But again, the fundamental disagreement is that they include this state of Ohio foundation payment impact. The city manager says, quote, "The state of Ohio distributes funding to local school districts based on a complex formula that accounts for many variables." And with that, we agree. I mean, it's a complex formula, without a doubt. The city manager does not provide an explanation in his letter, and I think we need to follow up with the city as to how the city calculated the impact on state foundation funding. Without getting into details, we need to understand what the city used to make that determination. But it's absolutely true that his conclusion that the school district's revenues increase because of tax abatements is entirely premised on that point. The letter is premised on the point of the difference in the state foundation formula. The last thing I'd say is that this notion that CPS's net annual revenue increases because of abatements is also inconsistent with the 99 agreement. The 99 agreement says that $5 million payment is intended to make the school district whole, recognizing that we're not going to be made whole from the 25% pilots. So again, back to that quote I read right at the beginning, it's not entirely consistent with what the 99 agreement says and was said to do. So any questions? That's Jen, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on their calculations. On the back of their letter, they sent a table where they were calculating the district's benefit from the state foundation formula using the abated values. And their numbers are so significantly different than our calculations that there's something different in the way we're doing it. And I would like to formally request the city to sit down and share, because I didn't do our calculations. I actually hired the state expert to do our calculations for us. And so there are some just significant nuances to the data that we need to reconcile, because there's just misinformation out there.
Mr. Messer.
Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate you keeping us kind of up to speed, not only with the background, but updating us on the letter that was sent and then I believe unsent yesterday. And I think that it didn't show me a willingness to collaborate and partner. It didn't show that, hey, we have this task to do together and for the betterment of our community, for our residents, taxpayers, schools, developers, everybody, you know, that could have been a tone that was taken, and it was unfortunately not. And when it says that the city is comfortable with or without the agreement, you know, what that tells me is this wasn't reviewed by the majority of people who are the city. And I think it should have said I or myself and whoever might have helped craft that letter. But what I know from the visit from Lauren and I, really on a separate subject, talking about the strategic plan at City Council, of course, the conversation kind of evolved to that. And we said, well, while we're here, how will this actually be decided upon? Who will make the decision? And it was very clear that it was going to be the committee led by P.G. Sittenfeld and the committee led by David Mann. And I think it's not a secret to know that they both support Cincinnati Public Schools to the nth degree. I know that they were not consulted in any letter that came out. And so what I feel like is, you know, we have a very unclear process that exists at the city, that part of our request needs to be, can you let us know, here's what we think we know, that was these two committees are what we were told. Please let us know what is the official process. And I think once we get that, then we can open up what I think is the elephant in the room. To me, this is an important piece. I don't think, though, that we can enter into any of these conversations without looking at a comprehensive review at our total taxation processes and programs in the city of Cincinnati. You can't just look at this side and pretend like the residential property abatements aren't also needing to have the same level of scrutiny. And you can't determine how much money you need here if you don't know how much money you're going to get there. That needs to be, I think, a part of it. You know, we're not the only city also that's having these discussions. If I'm sure you all know, Columbus started making some pretty significant changes mid last year, where they said it makes no sense to hand these out to everybody. So they started having zones. And if you're in the short north, you know short north, I mean, when you have $1 million condos going in, you probably don't need a lot of abatements. And that was a zone that was classified as one that you wouldn't get. But then they had zones where you would. Cleveland, just last week at City Council, said these programs are going to be reviewed and changed so that we are being discreet with where they're going. And what I think is really amazing is maybe in both cases, then they bundled it with how do we help this? You know, we're talking about residential and property and development and all this stuff. How do we have this help something that's very important to us, which is affordable housing? And they built in kind of the demands of the abatements and in requirements for building affordable housing or payments into affordable housing trust that then help solve that problem. All things that, you know, as we sit here, that has to be something we all care about. Our children are from those families that need that. So I think that, you know, my two big questions that I have right now is who at the city is ultimately the ones going to be leading these conversations. I believe there are at least 6 and perhaps 7 members of City Council who are eager to have a conversation and work through this in a very collaborative and positive way that don't reflect the tone of the letter. And I think, you know, I think everyone agrees this has to be a broader, complete taxation strategy discussion before we get too far into the process.
Thank you. Do any other board members have questions at this time? Ms. Bolton?
Thank you, and thanks, Dan, appreciate it. Appreciate particularly the later slides that help us kind of frame for us how to look at the letter and most particularly look at some of the evidence that they tried to present. A couple things. I would assume that this letter and the work is, to your point, been done by the administration, probably at the direction of the mayor, and probably the city council has said, I think as a group, making the district whole, I think is probably what they generally would have said. And of course, that's the rub. We don't know exactly what they think makes us whole versus what we think makes us whole. You mentioned something that there are certain abatements that are not requiring school board, school district approval. Is that an extensive list, or is the list, are we restricted to only talk about what is in 99, or can we expand or subtract some of the issues out of 99?
So the list of abatements that do not require school district approval are pretty extensive, I think, including, and I won't know the exact, each one has specific parameters, but I mean, cleaning up brownfield zones and the ones we see the most are CRAs and TIFs.
Right.
And for CRAs and TIFs, it's not that they can or cannot be approved with or without school district approval. It's that they can approve a greater percentage of a CRA if they have school district approval. So with on this slide, with agreement of the Board of Education, a CRA may be offered to abate up to 100% of taxes. And it's, I believe on a CRA, it's for a period of 15 years. Without the agreement of the Board of Education, they can only approve an abatement of 50% of those taxes, again, I believe for 15 years. For TIF districts, again, with the agreement of the Board of Ed, a TIF can be offered for up to 100% of the increased value for 30 years. Without, a TIF can only be offered by the city for 75% of new value for a period of 10 years. So it changes the flexibility they have in offering these kind of incentives.
If I might, having attended a couple of community meetings, neighborhoods are particularly concerned about this. And I've heard where part of the questioning and the reasoning is, can neighborhoods have any impact or input in these abatements? And we have nothing necessarily to do with that, but can a new agreement that we make, because other folks don't have the opportunity, because let's face it, this isn't just about school district, this is about other public entities, as well as possibly about neighborhoods that are not in a position to negotiate with the city about this. Is there a possibility that the agreement can be larger than, speak to a larger audience and larger clients than merely the school district? Or is it required that we can only negotiate on our own behalf? Let's say that first. Obviously, I think that's what we're trying to do, but it may not be where the public will is.
So, in terms of what we are able to negotiate, or what we could negotiate, I think the terms could be extensive and expansive and include all kinds of groups. I'll just say, in my view, making a determination, it's an interesting process, making a determination of whether or not somebody should get an incentive like this, whether a development is going to, whether the city would be better off with this development or not, and whether it needs that incentive in order to cause the developer to build here as opposed to another community. Those are really involved, risky sometimes, just interesting questions, and somewhat, in my view, outside of our core mandate.
Exactly.
Our core mandate is education, not necessarily getting into the really nitty-gritty of economic development, whereas I think it is sort of within the city's core mandate. Again, my recommendation is as simple as ensuring that the school district gets made whole. And if we do, if we feel like the repayment to CPS makes us whole, I'm comfortable recommending to you that this should be within the city's ability to determine whether or not incentives are appropriate or not. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that the issue for me is how expansive could this be?
Sure.
Or not be, and certainly our core mission is for our own financial. But having lived through a number of opportunities where we've had to negotiate difficult things, and it was great for the district, and because that's our code, that's our responsibility, it may not have been as good for others as it was for us. And so I think that we have a particular burden in that area, be it a neighborhood or be it the other public entities that aren't able to come to the table and have these sorts of discussions. And obviously, I'm just curious about how large this could be. And finally, you mentioned the residential piece, which is also hot around the city. The state prohibits discussion regarding residential abatement, or can residential abatement also become a part of this as well as commercial?
I don't think it prohibits it. I think our leverage in trying to negotiate to be reimbursed for residential abatements is limited because it's not subject to your approval. So the city can say, we could say, hey, we would like to be reimbursed for residential abatements. The city could offer those whether or not the school district gives its approval.
But it could be part of a requested package. And knowing which neighborhoods particularly are suffering, those often are people that have a significant say in what council does.
Sure, and our intent in showing this slide is that it certainly has a
diplomatically.
direct impact on us as well.
Right. I think I'll have other questions, but that's great. Oh, the in-kind thing I agree with, because they have not been trustworthy or reliable in that area. But there are things that only the city can do for our schools, around our schools, the infrastructure, the streets, the safety pieces. There are things there that we can't touch that they could touch. And rather than it being in-kind, some assurances regarding our safety around our schools and the infrastructure around our schools, I think should be something we should consider, because they've also not been reliable about that, considering we won that $1 million grant and only had $400,000 to $500,000 of it spent around our schools. So that's of interest to me, especially after this year of very, very difficult pedestrian safety.
Thank you. Any other questions from board members at this time? Thank you, Mr. Hoying. Thank you, Treasurer Wagner. We're going to have our next speaker come up, Michelle Dillingham.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it on the agenda. So I'm here representing the Cincinnati Educational Justice Coalition. We've been working since late 2017, specifically on the 1999 tax exemption agreement, first learning about it, collecting information, and then sharing that information across our city, all the while learning more and more, always learning. I mean, it's very complex. When you see me standing here, I want you to imagine hundreds of people standing here with me, students, parents, homeowners, residents, but also people from Columbus, our suburban districts, people from all over the country who are facing the same issue of tax avoidance. These thousands of people have shared with us that they are looking to all of us here in Cincinnati, the Board of Education and city officials, for changes to be made in these tax abatement programs. I'm gonna just, this slide right here is mostly visual. I'm just laying out a framework for my points. As a city, we have a clear record of inequity, and in fact, it's a conversation that tops our headlines weekly. In the realm of education, the unacceptable truth is one that parents, educators, students, and community already know, and that is our children continue to be subject to systemic racism, poverty, and inequity in our public schools. The national report, Failing Brown versus Board, was released last June. It proved what we all know. Children in the same city have two completely different educational experiences, and the dividing line in many cases is race and class. America has failed Brown v. Board. We have not even approached equality. There has been a lack of investment in children's education who are poor, Black, and brown. Some children have access and opportunity, and others do not. Legislators have allowed a quality public education for some, but not others. Our schools operate under an unconstitutional funding reality, proven to be unequal, especially for students with disabilities, students from poor families, students from Black and brown communities. Our schools have been sabotaged for years by policymakers who fail to fully fund them. Millions cut from our education budgets, while the wealthiest are given tax breaks. Our schools have been taken over by entrepreneurs who impose failed education models on Black, brown, and poor children, experiments that are not tolerated in higher income and whiter neighborhoods, as they take public taxpayer dollars for their own pockets. Public education funding and policy is anti-poor, elitist, racist, and we are here to demand the full funding of quality public education for all our children. Public education at its best is culturally relevant, engaging, challenging, smaller class sizes, experienced teachers, wraparound emotional, academic supports, student-centered school climates, meaningful parent community engagement, nurses, counselors on duty every day, students heading to college and careers with rich, critical thinking skills because they've had wide-ranging experiences in numerous academic fields. They've had career development programs. They've been on sports teams and extracurricular programs that's nourished their curiosity or nurtured a passion. They've had world languages, exposure to fields like architecture, business, medicine, and this is where our taxpayer dollars are earmarked for public education, and that's where they're supposed to go. But we see today that's not happening. So the answer is fair funding and getting those tax dollars where they're supposed to go. As we neared the 1999 agreement deadline, we recognized the need for significant community engagement. We noted that it wasn't happening on behalf of the city or even this body in a way that we had hoped, and so we launched our own. We hosted 3 sessions over 3 months, co-hosted by 22 local civic and nonprofit organizations. We solicited feedback from all social media platforms. We've presented at numerous events, community gatherings, including the Neighborhood Summit, community council meetings, clubs, testimony at City Hall, the press, op-eds in the newspapers, and more. So these photos here are just from the session in Madisonville, Westwood, and downtown, specifically on the 1999 agreement. So from all this community engagement, there was some findings that were revealed. I'll tell you, last night I spent 3 hours at the Oakley Community Council meeting and got to watch the frustration of community people as developers came through asking for CRA letters of approval, and just lots of questions about, well, where is our voice, right? Can we ask for this? Are we really empowered to get what we're asking for? Are you just here so we can check a box? It was very interesting to see their frustration. So the findings from the neighborhoods expressed just in the last few months centered on these items. I'm just going to cover a few. At the top of the list, of course, from our perspective, is school funding, recognizing that that slide that Dan showed where millions are foregone in dollars to CPS while we don't have the services we would like or need for our children. For us, the main finding of foregoing these millions of dollars in the name of economic development is a great concern for us. The next on the list is fair taxation. This was a theme that emerged quite regularly. Homeowners seeing the valuation of their homes go up due to surrounding development, even though they've made no improvements of their own, and then to have to pay higher property taxes because their surrounding neighbors have now brought in higher value homes, but yet their neighbors are not paying their full tax bill. So lots of concern about the fairness of the abatement programs. In fact, this concern has sparked and prompted the city to respond and convene a property tax working group that has formed, and they've had a few meetings so far. The other main area is, you could group it into accountability, transparency, and enforcement. I'll just tick off a few. Deals done before the community even hears about it, not enough monitoring, tracking, or enforcing, no due process. Corporations not making good on promises of job creation, leaving, and then the new tenant still gets the abatement with no new promises of job creation. Always hearing about promises of jobs, but when they don't happen, there's no consequence. Community benefit policies not really being monitored or legally binding. People feeling unheard, that the ink is already dry by the time the project comes. Lots of concern about the Port Authority, just confusion, not knowing what their role is and what they're really doing. Lack of transparency. Moving on to the commercial and residential abatement programs, essentially, although this is sort of a complicated issue, when people learn just a little bit about it and you share with them what's been going on, immediately they say, that doesn't make sense, we need to fix that. For example, people going down to City Hall and asking for renewals, getting another 5 or 10-year renewals of their abatements. Abatements being transferred to owners instead of staying with the property. There's no clawbacks. We've heard stories of owners being charged with fair housing violations, and yet they're still being awarded abatements from the city. The length of abatements being 10, 15, 30 years in some cases. Some feel we should eliminate these altogether. Abatements should be for the betterment of the community. We should be able to claw them back if we feel like they're not good neighbors, and the list goes on. So, and the last two, I'm not going to take the time here to go through it, but I can tell you there was great concern about issues of gentrification, displacement, housing affordability, also preservation and sustainability, usually in the areas of demolition. We heard from folks in Mount Lookout feeling that the way the incentives are, it's better to demolish and rebuild than to preserve, and that has concerned some neighbors. So those are our findings. So that leads us to the recommendations, and on the face of it, on the whole, we would say the current programs are not working for most of us. So we advance the following. Now, I know this slide has a lot of text, and I like to just do pictures, but I'm going to read this. Any new agreement should fairly compensate CPS for lost tax revenue and should assure unabated residential and commercial do not bear an unfair tax burden with respect to providing for public education and other community and social services that rely on property tax collections. And that should say unabated residential and commercial owners. Sorry, I missed a word there. So the new agreement should what? 1, regulate how abatements are granted by prioritizing equity, need, and the public good. And, you know, it's really easy to argue that that's not going on right now. Next check mark, we should grant abatements responsibly and fairly so that incentives and payments are fairly distributed to ensure our greatest public needs and services are met and robustly supported. Again, very clear ways to show that that's not happening, especially when you look at in the residential side, where most of the abatements are ending up is in the most highly resourced neighborhoods. And finally, abatement programs should enforce rules and regulations with effective oversight and strict accountability measures. I can tell you that when we first started exploring this and we tried to get information from City Hall, ultimately the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers had to FOIA the city to get the data, and even then it took 3 months to get data. So a very closed system that really should be open because this is public money. This is almost my last slide. And so here are some concrete recommendations, and I'm going to just go over them quickly, and some of you may recognize these because we are presenting these. These came out of the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers' research and recommendations, and all the elements that it hits really goes back to what the neighborhoods and the communities are wanting to see. So I'll start at the top. You heard mention of the $5 million cap. Well, given the numbers, we recommend that this should be at least $15 million to fairly compensate CPS for lost tax revenues, given the extensive abatements granted. Next one, future abatements, and that includes all, should be limited to 50% of improved value, not 100%. And they should last for no more than 10 years, as opposed to you can do up to 30 years now. Third, future abatements should be granted only in lower income neighborhoods that truly need development incentives. Fourth, advance public disclosure and public hearings allowing input from the board and impacted community councils before any tax abatements are approved. I can tell you it was very clear. You can go to any community council and see this happen. When developers come, they're looking for that checkbox from the community, but they've typically already got a developer agreement in play. Next, establish a tax abatement oversight committee with the power to review and make recommendations on future tax abatements and policy. This should include representation from you, the Cincinnati Board of Education, and other stakeholders. And finally, provide the Board of Ed the power to specifically approve or reject any individual development calling for an abatement in excess of $1 million. That's just a few. I can tell you that there's other groups. I want to specifically call out the Peaslee Neighborhood Center, who's been working on an equitable development rubric that puts a whole lot of empowerment into communities and neighbors of incoming developments. They have a scorecard that's very dynamic. So this is by no means exhaustive. It's just a few things for you to consider as you negotiate. And in closing, I want to give a special thanks to the hundreds of community, parents, teachers, concerned citizens who've contributed to this engagement summary, and to the nonprofit and civic community members, some of which are listed here with their logos, for their support of the engagement sessions. This was a lot of work, and it was really important to us that the public is heard. These are major decisions. And finally, I'd like to say that the Education Justice Coalition, we helped to elevate into the public debate what has been almost totally absent, the issue of our children in our public schools getting the short end of the stick, property owners having to pass school levies, all the while wealthy developers and investors profiting because they're not paying their fair share. The 1999 original deal was not negotiated with the children at heart. I would say that. If you read it, I'm looking at it and I don't see a very strong position for CPS in 1999. And I know you guys probably weren't there in 1999, but you're here now. And so we are asking you to please fight for fair funding for our children and for our schools, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Before you leave the podium, I want to give board members an opportunity to ask questions. Board members, you have questions of Ms. Dillingham at this point in time? I have one, but anybody else? Mr. Messer.
Yeah, thank you. Not just for today, but for helping to raise awareness in the community and make sure that everyday people who have to pay these taxes, who are impacted by these taxes or the lack of in some cases, that they're being brought along to the process, because so many times these things happen in a vacuum and they unfortunately don't get out to the people who need to hear them. So thank you for the work that you did to engage people throughout the community, and we will continue to do that as well following today. And I think it's also important that we challenge our friends at City Hall to do the same thing and make sure that we again, bring along that conversation on the residential tax abatement. I think this, the payment, the $5 to $15 million payment, these are things where, you know, I'm getting like this deep into it, and then I feel like now I need some experts to like coach me through to ensure that we're not double taxing people, and that, you know, their taxes, they're paying their taxes and then they're paying the additional on top versus maybe another mechanism that wouldn't do that. So that's just one that I want to get a little bit more clarity to. But one in particular that I think, you know, to my fellow board members, I love this oversight committee, and might say something that's would be unpopular to some people, but you know, one thing during the election year that I found appalling is that a friend who opened a business near Findlay Market, and they applied through the process, and they were told in order for them to get that abatement approved for their business that they were opening up, they had to have a private meeting with the mayor. Mm-hmm. And to me, it should be a process that is objective. I mean, it sounds like something that may happen in Washington at this time, but it shouldn't be happening in Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that oversight committee would be a very wise thing just for people in general in this community to be able to say that there is an independent body. Because I think there's a lot of skepticism on who's getting those abatements and how. And it's supposed to be where the development wouldn't be happening otherwise. Right. Well, that seems to be completely off. So I especially appreciate that part of your recommendation.
Can I just respond? There actually is codified in state law that there has to be an oversight committee, and if you go to the city's website, there is a tax review committee that is has a few people on it. I'm not sure what they review, and I know a former member of that group, Mike Morgan, sort of very publicly resigned from the group, citing the fact that he was not getting information as a member, and he felt compelled to quit because he was unable to get from the administration what he thought he should get as a member. So, you know, either strengthening what's already there, and again, adding someone from the Board of Education or from the public would be a good step.
Ms. Dillingham, my question is pretty simple. Where did that $15 million, your first recommendation on how the dollar amount needed to make the district whole, the $15 million was determined how?
I'm going to defer that answer to Mr. Don Mooney because he helped pull those numbers together, and he's the numbers guy. I'm a social worker, so that's not my strength, but those are sourced from real numbers, and I'll let him answer that.
Thank you. Other questions? Ms. Bolton?
Yeah, thank you for gathering the organizations to host the community meetings that you had, because I think you all have elevated the issue of tax abatement and provided a dialogue. The question I would have is, on that oversight committee, if indeed one exists, and you're saying it does, and that's news to me, and shame on me for not knowing that, it would be interesting if somehow it not only necessarily us, because we can hopefully at the end of the next agreement have a little bit more discretion and opportunity than we have had for 20 years about this. It would seem that somehow the neighborhood association, the Invest in Neighborhoods, or the neighborhood movement within the city should probably be able to have one of those seats. And obviously, it should not necessarily be mayor appointed
as it is
for obvious
currently,
reasons. Yeah. But, and I'm not just saying that about this mayor, but any mayor, because the executive feels so strongly about economic development that indeed that seems to push a lot of other considerations aside. But the oversight, I would say we would be hesitant to have an oversight committee view what we do, but considering we have to go to the public all the time to get money, we kind of have the largest oversight committee in town, which is the taxpayers and the voters. So I feel a little bit better about that, but I appreciate the specific recommendations from CFT and most particularly what you've been able to do in the community. we have a big responsibility to try to do the best we can with this.
Thank you.
I would just say in closing, I think the FC Stadium project really magnified the issue, because we started this campaign before the FC dropped on us. And then when that dropped, all of a sudden, everyone was talking about TIFs, property tax abatements, the port, the 1999 agreement, because that's how these big deals, get put together. And it's been made clear that the public taxpayer is certainly not always the one being listened to or respected in these processes. And I think that's a great example of that. Much to improve. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Okay. We are now at the item on our agenda for hearing the public. Each speaker has 3 minutes to speak, and Mrs. Wagner will be our timekeeper. When the buzzer goes off, your 3 minutes are up. Please refrain from discussing any personnel items. When your name is called, please come to the podium to speak. We have 5 speakers. I'll call the first 3. Sue Mangan, Craig Rosen, Don Mooney.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Ms. Bolton.
A question to the chair. Normally, it is not our intention or practice after someone speaks during the hearing of the public to actually participate in dialogue. Knowing your interest in having this be an engagement session more than an official meeting, are we operating under the traditional methods, or are you considering if we have questions of the speaker? How do you want to handle that?
I certainly, as I stated earlier, because people did sign up for a specified amount of time, I want to honor that, give them the 3 minutes. However, I think after our speakers talk, we'd want to open it up. So if you have questions for any particular speaker, those questions can be raised not only by the board, but also by our audience.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here. The questions regarding tax abatements in Cincinnati Public Schools have many elements. Foremost for the school board is the community's civic duty to support a comprehensive and equitable education for the children of our district. However, in order to be good citizens, this responsibility rests with all players, not just the school board. With eyes wide open, we need to look at the impact of the property tax incentive letter the city manager's office sent out yesterday. According to their interpretation of tax abatement policies, the schools must continue with the approach created 20 years ago, or the losses to school funding will be devastating. There is a tone in the report that shows rigidness to the consideration of other approaches to the issue. There is a clear lack of interest in good faith negotiations. They have used select numbers to create a scenario that they are not willing to dispute. It's a take it or leave it approach, and very offensive to those of us who worked at learning how the current abatement system is impacting our community and are not looking at tax abatements through rose-colored glasses. The city manager's office doesn't mention that residential abatement holders make no payment to the school district in lieu of taxes, even though they are part of the school district that educates their children. The report doesn't mention that state funding formulas change at the whims of politicians in Columbus every couple of years. There's no mention that after 20 years, the fair share owed by the commercial development needs to be proportionate to the cost of education in 2019 and beyond. There is no mention that the city is increasingly becoming unaffordable to people who have lived here and paid their fair share of taxes for decades. The city manager's vision for Cincinnati is limited and dangerous. Residential property taxes have maxed out for most residents. How is the school board going to convince property owners to continue to pass levies when taxes here have become so high that residents are moving? When we are freely giving commercial and residential tax abatements to entities with little accountability, when we allow corporate interests to dictate the terms of our city's earning tax, and when the Port Authority becomes a tool wealthy developers access to avoid paying for the services they use, the tax base becomes the default responsibility of property owners. This is not sustainable. The school board has a huge challenge ahead. There is a myth that is propagated around the country about the tax magic of abatements and other forms of corporate welfare. That claim is that the progress of a city can only occur when wealthy individuals and private entities receive huge tax breaks. What about their civic responsibility to the community where they live and do business? It's become normalized to expect their only responsibility is to make a profit. Looked at more closely, it is clear that tax breaks for the wealthy have given us a country of vast inequality. The benefits are going back to the wealthy and not trickling down to the majority. I implore you to stay strong against the forces that promote the false promises of abatements and other tax incentives.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, President Jones,
Good afternoon.
board members, Superintendent Mitchell, Treasurer Wagner, those in attendance. My name is Craig Rosen, and I'm an Oakley resident, proud parent of 2 CPS students. As we've heard today, the community has well over 24 times come together in the last 3 months to discuss community reinvestment agreements, tax incentives, and other opportunities that we can help make not only our school district whole, but also our community and neighborhoods. I have been included in either the planning, the attending, or even moderating some of those, and I think I'm in a unique position where I understand school funding, and I also understand what the communities are saying. All you have to do is show up, as Michelle Dillingham did last night, to one of the regular community council meetings that are offered and hear what's happening with the developers. Some of the previous tricks that developers have used is to take a piece of property, quickly demolish the structure that's on it, whether we're talking commercial or residential, file for a reevaluation of the assessed taxes, lock in those taxes, and then go start working their memorandums of understandings, letters of intents, or what other dealings that they can do within the city administration. It is only then that they come at the end stage in their final development plan to ask for the community to submit or approve of their community reinvestment agreement. CPS hears about this even later. Last night in Oakley, we had 3 businesses come in looking for these requests. And the new trend is now to offer the community council a few dollars out of those percents. So last night we heard, and I think this shocked those that were in attendance, we heard that for $30,000 a year, we will kick back some proceeds directly to the community council to put in the community council coffer. We saw it recently when we were talking about the Liberty Street Road diet and trying to put neighborhood versus neighborhood together. While I personally agree with Treasurer Wagner and General Counsel Hoynes' recommendations, also as a member of the CEJC, I agree with their recommendations. These are broad and general ideas. They're not getting into the weeds. And so therefore, I'm humbly asking that we have more working group and engagement opportunities for you guys to hear what the communities are feeling and where their positions are as far as the taxation here in our city. My concern is, as Sue alluded to earlier, that as we look at 3 levies in the next 4 years and possibly a new money request needed soon thereafter, our communities are wising up to the fact that, yes, if we do it's just a simple renewal levy this year, we don't substitute it or we don't extend the term of it, but just a simple renewal levy, and we're able to say this will not renew your taxes, that's not good enough anymore because people are realizing, while it might not renew my taxes, if I don't pass it, it possibly could lower my taxes. And that's a terrible position to put our district in. So I humbly ask that we continue and look at various engagement opportunities to hear what the public is talking about. And if need be, we also look at possibly extending for a period of 6 months to allow, much like Board Member Messer said, a full stakeholder engagement opportunity to discuss what is best, not just for our school children, but our neighborhoods and communities. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm
Good
Don
evening.
Mooney. I'm the junior field representative for Cincinnati Federation of Teachers. And Julie Sellers, we're having our membership meeting tonight. She asked me to come and represent CFT, partly because I've been working on this subject over the last year or so. I've shared information with your audit committee. Initially, it was not very easy to try to get a handle on the numbers here. We had to beat on the city through public records requests to get some information, but I'm confident now, at least pretty confident, that the work of Dan and Jennifer in pulling together the presentation you saw tonight gets you pretty close to the numbers. Although I must say, I looked over the manager's letter and the attachment to it, and the numbers keep getting bigger. At the end of 2018, the city auditor, or rather the county auditor, presented some numbers that said there were about $3.4 billion of property that was abated. The manager's attachment, if you look at it, and it doesn't include property owned by the Port Authority, suddenly it's up to $3.8 billion. So the amount of money that's being abated and lost to not simply the school district, but to other institutions that rely on property taxes is getting larger and larger by the month. If you think about it and do the math, that means about 20% of the private, commercial, and real estate property value in the city is not taxed. And that percentage is going to keep getting bigger unless the school board and community groups essentially gang up on city council and say this tax abatement palooza has to come to an end. I did want to address briefly the city manager's letter because I had a chance to read that yesterday and I started thinking about it, and this is what I loved about it. It says, his calculation, our city schools actually make $7,500 every time the city allows a developer or a campaign donor one more $1 million tax abatement. So think about it. If that's true, why don't we all get a tax abatement? Because the city or the school district would get millions of more dollars based on this formula. Well, obviously the magic solution suggested by that to our school funding crisis in Ohio isn't really going to come true. And the reason is that his calculation skips a couple of points. One, it doesn't count all those residential abatements. He talks about pilot payments, and some people do make pilot payments, but not residentially abated property. And as Dan mentioned, he also assumes that the school funding formula in Ohio will simply continue on the way it is, no matter how many tax abatements are granted. So that if you're a city that abates everybody, you're just going to get more and more tax dollars from the state of Ohio to make up for that. I think we know that's not true. Thanks for your attention tonight.
Thank you. Our next two speakers, Mark Lim and Marlena Brookfield.
Hi, thanks for
Hello.
having me. My name is Mark Lim. I'm from Clifton. I currently work at the University of Cincinnati. I'm supporting the renegotiation of the 1999 tax abatement agreement to increase CPS funding, and I'm speaking as a concerned community member. So I arrived in Cincinnati from New York in 2012, and I served for 1 year as an AmeriCorps, working for CPS students as a college access advisor. Across 7 schools, and I noticed through that time a lack of awareness, a lack of guidance, and a lack of opportunity for those graduating seniors, even from Walnut Hills, to say nothing of the other schools that I served at that time, in terms of not receiving services from their guidance counselors. I also have a friend who's currently working as a middle school math teacher at a Cincinnati public school, And his students are currently in need of several grade levels of remediation to the point where he's currently entering a PhD program to study how do you educate students in math when you have students at a 7th grade level and a 2nd grade level in the same classroom. And lastly, I've heard from a counselor working at Hughes, which is across the street from UC, and he was expressing frustration that there's not a Hughes to UC pipeline for those students to have that opportunity to just go across the street. And now that I work at the university, at the College of Nursing, I got an inside view into a little bit of this. So there's a 6-figure multi-year grant that the College of Nursing received to promote nursing careers to Hughes students. And none of the students in the first cohort were able to actually attend the College of Nursing, despite their opportunity to receive full scholarships through the Cincinnati Pride Grant. So that's a big concern. And I heard from the AmeriCorps volunteers who were working on that project that they feel that the lack of funding for Hughes teachers is the primary reason that they're not able to see those students enter the College of Nursing. So the AmeriCorps and a nursing grant, those are not funded by city taxes, and these are Band-Aids that are just not enough. So I feel that well-meaning people can only do so much to address the root issue. We need to prepare Cincinnati for tomorrow with tax justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, board. This is
Good
going to fall out of you. So my comments are in response to the memo from the city manager. But first, a couple facts. You mentioned 45% of our revenue is from local property taxes. Year to date, right now, it's 52.3%. So he's at least 7 percentage points off. Another thing that is not in there, but I think is very relevant to the conversation, is 1 in 5 teachers has to work a second job to make ends meet. In what is supposed to be the greatest country in the world, that is immoral, it's unconscionable. I don't understand why the people who are in charge of educating our future can't get by. That's something else. But what I want to say is that every single dollar we have counts. As a parent of a student currently attending CPS schools, I resent and am deeply offended by the memo that was sent from the city manager's office. It's pitting the entities, CPS Board and the city of Cincinnati against each other, painting the picture that it's you versus them. Well, when are we, the people, gonna be part of that conversation? To say that you haven't heard from us is a bold-faced lie. I know you've heard from us. They've heard from us too. What I find the most egregious and the most damning is that the well-being of children and their education is not part of this discussion. While they figure out their lives, our children are still suffering from the disastrous effects of decreased funding. This is not a game. It's not a political game. So when does the conversation become, how do we do the right thing for people, for children, and not for profits? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our speakers, especially for, this could have been, I think, expanded, your time at the podium, but we sort of kept with our traditional practices. But I think this is an appropriate time for us to really engage in a dialogue and ask questions and talk to each other about what we've heard. The intent of this meeting was to really not only be an engagement opportunity, but also to do some fact-finding. And I think we had lots of information, and we documented the recommendations made by our presenters. And so if there are questions, both from board members and from the audience, please, I'm asking you, just raise your hand and be acknowledged, and we'll get your questions answered. Mr. Rosen, you go first. Do we have a mic? Yeah, thank you. Is it a movable? Can it be transported up there? No. Okay. All right. So come on down. And anybody else in the audience, if you have a question, just come on down up to the mic and ask your question, please.
Again, I'd like to thank the board and the administration for having an open dialogue. My question has more to do with the desired timetable of the board and the administration as we go forward, and what the board envisions engagement to look like. While many people are upset about the FCC stadium situation, I think it was very impressive how the board stood their ground and demanded what was fair out of a very unique situation. So I'm curious going forward what that timetable might look like so that we can share that with the community.
I don't think we've decided what the timetable looks like. I think that's one of the things that is a product of this meeting, is that we do need to decide that timetable. So I don't think we've decided that tonight. Mr. Messer.
Yeah, and barring an extension, obviously we're up against December 31st deadline, and I think that there is an opportunity for alignment, that we can't have just this piece of the conversation. As I said earlier, again, just my opinion, I think it has to be a broader taxation strategy conversation that also includes the residential piece and the processes and the transparency, how it's tracked at the city. Anybody in this city should be able to click on a website and see the list and how much is on the till. The fact that, I remember we first began this last year, I thought, oh, well, this is great. Former Vice Mayor Mann is chair of the Finance Committee, or the Budget Committee at City Council. I'm just gonna call him and say, hey, could you provide our Finance Committee an update? He said, I would be glad to, Ryan. We'll work on getting that. My chief of staff will coordinate. Got a note, hey, we're working on this. And finally got the call to say, it doesn't exist. Now, how in the world does something like that not exist? So I think the whole thing, the transparency and everything built into this, and yes, it'd be really easy to say, well, let's just do what we did in that 99 agreement. Well, the world's a different place. And I go back to, there are some things that I believe we should demand. With a student population of 79.8% in poverty, we should have housing, fair, equitable, affordable housing included in that conversation. We should be championing that, as well as, of course, other people in the community. So I don't think we can, until we find out the governance from the city of who's actually going to be responsible for doing this, I don't know that we can get an idea of who the timeline is.
I would just add that the reason I'm asking the question is because for the last several months I've been able to attend, whether it's a private tax working group hosted by Councilman Smitherman or Councilmember Sittenfeld's open discussions in chambers, and the city has come out with a different stance that they have taken. It's been in their open meetings, you can see it online, but from them, if you look at them, they're either gonna do a deal or the cake's already baked. And so I really appreciate this board saying, wait a minute, we need to have these discussions. Nothing has been done yet, and we wanna hear from the community. I would also add there's other creative tools such as affordable housing is very important. Our family poverty is important, but we also have a senior population that is struggling about aging in place. And so there's all these different opportunities that we can discuss that when you talk incentives and consideration, we should consider.
I think, Mr. Rosen, what you're saying to us is that there is sort of an immediacy to at least having some conversation with the city so that we can begin to frame all the recommendations and have time so that we can frame these recommendations, talk about them, and make some decisions about how we move forward. That's what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah,
Okay.
very similar. I would
Okay.
just add that we would like, as Board Member Messer and Ms. Bolton have said, is to look at what other cities have done, such as the Columbus plan, which I've talked about, that had a 1.5 years of stakeholder engagement. I'm not saying we necessarily need that, but there are some opportunities to engage, and knowing what the will of the board and the timetable desired would be
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bolton?
Yes, to my way of thinking, because we do have a renewal in November, ideally, you would not want to have this discussion or whatever occurring during the time that we're trying to convince people about the renewal, because it would muddy the waters. So for me, I see more of either a fast track, or what I worry about is the point you just made, is a sense that perhaps the administration in the city is ready to just say, well, if you haven't gotten, and we don't have a new agreement, we're just not going to have one. So their interest might be in delaying as long as possible, because right now they know that the community is very interested and very involved with this, and it won't be hard, but it'll be difficult for the community to sustain it. So for my way of thinking, after we get the input that we're getting from our experts and from the community and listening to these recommendations, it would seem to me the board gets together, figures out what the overall strategy is based upon, in part, the administration's recommendation, but also the community, and say, go forth and negotiate this, because I do think that's part of their, at least the administration's strategy for the city. You either are ready with some sort of an agreement to follow this, or we don't need to have one. And very frankly, the community needs to be pushing and advocating a lot in front of City Council. Because right now, it doesn't sound like City Council is in charge of setting the parameters of what this negotiations is going to be.
Thank you. Ms. Mangan?
I'm also concerned about the time frame, because in the summer, City Council rarely meets. I don't think you guys meet either, do you?
Oh, yeah,
Yes, we do.
You do, all on a regular
We just like
schedule?
each other so
Do you meet on a regular schedule?
Yes,
Okay.
We do.
Because I agree, in the fall, this is going to become a hot problem for people running for office. And also, I'm wondering, do all of you feel that you have a comprehensive understanding of what these abatements are about, or do you feel you need some additional education on the topic before you get into the expertise of the wealth interest?
does anybody want to comment on that? Ms.
I can
Bolton?
speak to a little bit. I always need more information and more education, but what I feel confident about, knowing where we started, I feel confident about what our administration has been able to do and research and get to us those facts. What I think has been helpful for me is expanding the parameter of what this agreement might look like, meaning not just using only the current 99 agreement as the skeleton and then just somehow putting in new numbers there. I think the community is saying to us, we want a more comprehensive effort, and it can be about the schools and the fair funding or whatever, but I feel I'm getting better and better aware of what I think the community's worrying about and is concerned about. And the ultimate thing is how people feel about their property taxes, because that's going to impact us greatly over the next 4 years, if indeed they do feel as though they have been unfairly taxed. And I think that's a movement that's out there.
I hear it in my neighborhood. You know, right on my street, there's a house being built next to a small house, a giant house being built next to a small house. That giant house is going to have children in Cincinnati public schools. They're going to be abated. they're not paying their fair share for the education of their own children. And people on the street are already saying they're angry about this. And, you know, it's in Hyde Park. It's worse. The anger is stronger in other neighborhoods. Anyway, I just am hoping, you know, that you can work with City Council soon and try to find a way to include the public and keep it transparent.
Yes. Ms. Bates?
You know, one thing we haven't discussed, and I'm not sure if this would be a good point to put into the agreement, but to demand from the city a list of the criteria that they're using for determining what abatements are going to be approved. Because we don't have a clue what, you know, it's a meeting with the mayor, pretty much. And I don't see that council, you know, it's a de facto vote. From what I understand, there's not a lot of conversation at council around these abatements. But if we can include in our agreement, you know, a knowledge of the criteria that's being used, I think that would be helpful to the community and give more confidence for the community in the agreement that we put together. You don't think that'll do?
No, I agree with you completely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah.
Reading this letter.
I think the community wants to feel they can trust that you and city council are going to do everything you can to understand the long-term consequences. You know, the city seems to only want to show the positive, but as we've heard,
Right.
there are negatives.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Ms. Gibbs?
Unbelievable.
Can you see me? Carol. Can we share this?
I think it's time
Hold-
before Carol.
Hold on.
This is public information. This is what we're all.
Hold on. Troops are getting out of control. We just got a letter.
Just read a letter.
We just got a letter, and so they're asking that we read the letter before you make your comment. Is that okay?
They saw me stand.
Okay. And I'm going to ask our vice president to read this letter.
I'll try to do so
Fasten your
without
seatbelts,
gasping.
folks.
Dear City Manager Dehaney and Superintendent Mitchell, we have followed with interest the discussions underway around the future of the 1999 City CPS Tax Abatement Agreement. We understand that both the City of Cincinnati and Cincinnati Public Schools recognize the importance of continued economic growth in our community and well-funded schools that provide strong educational opportunities for our children. All parties understand that relevant, impartial data will be key to the ultimate resolution of these discussions. Our organizations, the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber, the Cincinnati Business Committee, and the Cincinnati Regional Business Committee, are interested in helping both parties gather and understand the financial impact of the agreement and are looking to engage a third party to provide assistance. We look forward to working with the city and CPS on this issue. Please let us know if you have thoughts or questions at this time.
So are they
Okay.
asking me to facilitate?
It's you,
Okay,
Carol.
so, wait, I think we just got the letter. And I think we owed it to the public to share that information. I want to caution or just advise the board that we really need to consider also the content of this letter. So I don't want us to get into a discussion about this letter. We just wanted to share it. So Ms. Gibbs, go ahead. I'm sorry?
It's not even to us. I don't even know why we got a copy of this.
Oh.
This letter's not even to us.
Okay, Ms. Gibbs, go ahead.
So there was some conversation about the taxes increasing to the point where it causes people to not be able to stay in their homes. And I just wanted to informationally say that the Vice Mayor Smitherman and I are co-chairing a group called the Property Tax Working Group. And we are addressing property taxes for seniors who are legacies in neighborhoods and those with disabilities, to try to freeze property taxes, not get rid of them, but freeze them at that lower amount so that people can stay. Oh, 2 microphones, wow. So that they can stay in their homes and we don't lose those residents who have been there for decades, who've raised their children, probably gone to Cincinnati Public. You know, they deserve to be able to stay, and while, you know, developers are building homes, no matter what the value is, if someone has a $60,000 home and there's a $1 million home built across the street, we don't want to lose those folks, or at least give them the choice of whether they want to stay or not.
Thank you. Ms. Prather.
Hello, wonderful people.
Hello.
Hi. I just want to say that I can really appreciate the fact that you all are providing pushback and saying that you need to hear from the public before you make any decisions. And I also have concerns about Patrick Duhaney's letter. I have major...
I'm sorry, but we're having a hard time hearing.
While I can appreciate... Can you hear me now? Hello? 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 Can you hear me?
Yeah, try that.
Okay. While I can appreciate the fact that you all are providing pushback and saying that you need to hear from the public before you make any decisions about the 99 agreement, and I also have concerns about Patrick Duhaney's letter, what this reminds me of, considering that it reminds me of political theater. The fact that the school board is being pitted against city council, it reminds me of what's taking place in Washington in terms of the distractions. In Washington, D.C., when bills are being pushed behind the scenes, what happens is they cause a major distraction and pit one side against the other. The reason I'm bringing this before you all is because this is an election year. This is an election year, and historically what will happen is people will pass the buck when they don't want to be held accountable. In the spirit of transparency and the fact that development plans are implemented 20 years in advance, people know what's going to happen. I mean, I could predict what would happen based on the period of civil unrest in the West End and date it back to now. But even with that said, my question is, now that, you know, most of the board members, or a lot of the board members who are here, especially those who have been here for a long time, you supported FC Cincinnati going into the West End. My concern is that, and I think that elections have consequences and individuals should be held accountable. That's just my personal opinion. Not only CPS board members, but also school board members, the county commissioners, anyone who supported FC Cincinnati going into the West End should be held accountable, because sadly, people are being displaced, students are losing their home, or families are losing their homes, and students are being impacted in terms of not being able to concentrate on school because FC Cincinnati is building right in their backyard and causing a distraction. So considering the history of broken promises, the fact that even though they said there would be no displacement, there is definitely a lot of displacement. 1,800 people are being displaced from the community, including a lot of the pupils. And considering that District 1 police station, they're already selling District 1 police station. So ultimately, what we believe will happen from the Poor People's Campaign and the NAACP is that Tabb High School will be sold. What, if anything, is the board prepared to do in the event Tabb High School will be relocated? Have you all considered that? And I know that you were not here in 99, you weren't here in 99, but you are here now. And, you know, I'm really big on the 5 Ps. Prior planning prevents poor performance. So considering that you have a grand opportunity to think ahead, use foresight, and think about your students, what, if anything, have you all considered doing for Tabb High School students if that school has to move, if FC Cincinnati decides to purchase Tabb like they decided to purchase District 1 police station?
Ms. Bates.
Yeah, a couple things.
Okay.
The board did not support the FC Cincinnati Stadium going into the West End.
Okay.
What we supported was a financial deal that was in the best interest of the district.
Okay.
That's what we supported. But
Okay.
our vote was not to support.
A financial deal that was best for the district, but that deal involved FC Cincinnati, correct? Is that correct?
Well, we made the deal with them.
Right,
For
so the
sure.
deal involved FC Cincinnati, and ultimately the plan, the stadium being placed where Stargell Stadium was, and Tabb High School Stadium being placed across the street. So that's a play on words.
Right, but that was the interest of the district.
Right.
So-
And so ultimately, it supported FC Cincinnati and the displacement of the citizens. I mean, I'm not here to argue, I'm just saying, what are you prepared to do to help Tabb High School students? Because at the end of the day, it should be about pupils.
I wouldn't take that leap,
Okay.
that second leap. That
Okay.
was not
Right.
the vote or the intent, or I believe our responsibility. Our responsibility was to the district.
Okay.
And that's what we negotiated. And I know there are rumors about Taft High School being purchased. We have not been approached about the purchase of Taft High School,
Right.
Okay.
period.
Okay, and Cincinnati police officers weren't approached about District 1 being purchased. But, so if you were to use foresight, what would you do for Tabb High School students who are displaced? I mean, have you thought about a plan since,
We,
you know, I
we,
know that...
we can't think about something we don't even know about. I
Right.
mean, as far from where we sit right now, that's a rumor. We don't know anything about that. That's certainly not what we're hearing.
Right.
At all. And so, and I think, and I'm just in the spirit of being transparent, I feel like this whole issue about FCC, as Ms. Bates said, we did it in the best interest of the district. I don't want this has become such a political issue that gets melded around the tax abatement and everything else. The discussion about FCC actually, in some ways, and I'm saying the discussion about it in some ways was good, because here we are now talking about tax abatements.
Right.
And what the fairness and unfairness of that was.
Right.
So the FCC, all that stuff is, for me, is just, I don't even have the words to describe it. I just think it's a non-issue for us right now.
I mean, just me as a tax-paying citizen, I was able to use foresight and predict what would happen to the community, and we were totally opposed against this because we knew that the tax abatements were coming, we knew that the displacement was coming, and we hold, again, I believe the elections have consequences, and elected officials should be able to use foresight as well. And so I guess to you, President Jones, for you to say that it's not something that you're thinking about right now. I'm thinking about the students, and my heart continues to break for them. And
I didn't say I didn't care.
No, I'm not saying you don't care, but
right.
You did something like this. What I'm saying to you is that I care about the students more than anything, and this deal was not about education, and it's resulting in displacement, and it's heartbreaking. So thank you all for hearing me out,
you.
and you all have a good day.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for having this open dialogue. My name is Bill Menrath. I'm a taxpayer, a voter, and an irate citizen. I moved into the city of Cincinnati in 1970, and ever since then I've voted for every levy supporting public education because I believe that's the best investment I can make in the city of Cincinnati. So I don't mind paying taxes, but I feel that it's unfair. The current system is unfair because of the abatements that other people get. And I would like to encourage the board to work toward a more fair, taxable or equitable system to support the Board of Ed, to support public education in the city of Cincinnati. So this is not a question, it's just a comment. And again, I thank you for having this dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so it seems that we don't have anybody else waiting to speak, so I'm gonna, in the interest of time, want to ask board members if we want to close out and maybe identify some next steps. Just to share, I know that we've documented the recommendations. I have an extensive list here, and I'm sure that our staff also took notes on this, that will help give us some direction. But any closing comments or next steps from the membership here before we close out? We've got our work to do on a quick timeline is one of the things that I heard. Ms. Bates.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you took great notes. And we received feedback from people tonight, from our audit committee, from people in the community that CEJC brought back to us. And I'm very much in favor of putting that together and following kind of the same process we did when we put together the resolution regarding our financial deal with FC Cincinnati.
Right.
And
Sounds
moving
good.
on that pretty quickly, having some discussion with the board and a first reading, and then moving forward. So I think that
Sounds
would
good.
be a
Yeah.
solid next step.
Okay. Mr. Messer?
Yeah, first a statement. I mean, I think, first of all, I want to thank everybody that came here tonight to weigh in on this. And I won't speak on behalf of the entire board, but I'll just kind of hint at it. I think there's a whole lot of alignment on both sides of this table where we sit. I think that making our schools whole, looking at new and creative ways, not just here, but kind of comprehensively in our taxation strategy and that type of thing. I don't think anybody that, or any conversations in any of our meetings have said anything other than we've got to think bigger and creatively for the betterment of our city, our students, our schools, et cetera. Where I think, you know, just putting on my work hat, what I feel like we're just going to spin in the mud until we get a chart that says, here's who's negotiating, here's the process, here's how we engage the community, and then here's the target date. And that should be available to everybody. So I think if we could just figure out from the city who's there, and, you know, ultimately, you know, if it's all about getting everybody here, because we've played that game, trying to get all of our calendars together with all of city council together, but perhaps we designate somebody sitting here to say, you serve on the team, because I think we have to have some of our board. So my opinion is that has to be part of the representation. And I think city council should do the same. And I think then, you know, as the process goes along, that person can then report back to their boards and to the people that come to their board meetings, so that, you know, we don't weigh it down by saying, you know, everybody from every board has to be in every meeting. So if we start with the governance piece, and, you know, we read that letter, the one thing I will call out is when there are complex problems like this in my work life, it is very helpful to have a third party who generally knows nothing about the situation to say, what am I hearing you say? What am I hearing you say? Okay, great. Is this what you said? And then you build that alignment and you start to move forward. The key, though, is finding somebody that all entities trust. And that is my main concern. But if we use, you know, I don't just put it out there, the Community Building Institute or the, you know, the Niehoff Center had some consultants that did some work, or other organizations that have, or maybe Deloitte or one of the local firms who have process drivers. I think if the organizations could come together and say, we would trust this, having a process driver that would say, oh, guys, this is the point where we promise to have public engagement. It's going to happen on this date, and here's what has to happen to make that. If we just kind of try to bolt it together as we go, I think we're going to constantly spin. So that piece of the letter, I think, could help as long as we could find an independent third party that people could trust.
Ms. Bates?
Except that the letter did not come to us. The letter very strategically went to the two administrations, and those do not have to be public meetings.
Right.
That's the intent of why it went to Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Dehaney. So don't think that this is about public engagement with the third party.
Which is why I did not want to talk about the letter. So there is, but anyway, thank you. Mr. Davis, and then Ms. Bolton.
Mr. Jones, I did a good job, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Thank you. To Mr. Messer's point in regard to who is responsible I believe the city manager and the superintendent are ultimately responsible for negotiating the deal around tax abatements. I don't know that we'll be able to forge the political background to those responsible parties. At the end of the day, those are the responsible parties. I'm going to hold true to not addressing either of the letters.
Thank you.
But I will say that I think we have to move with haste, and we have to press and be on the offensive. And I too want to thank everybody that came here today. And I didn't get a chance to thank Michelle when she was at the podium, but I do want to thank you, Michelle, and all the work that you and your organization and the plethora of organizations that have come together, because it's really important that the community leads this from a very real perspective, that these tax abatements are hurting the community more than anybody. And our kids are getting, I think you called it the short end of the stick.
Yes.
If any stick at all. And I'm very appreciative of the process that, Madam Chair, you've chosen to go about. I just think we need to move with some haste in regards to how we come about ensuring more input from the community and different opportunities for the community to input on not just what we do, but how we do it.
Gotcha. Ms. Bolton?
Thank you. I would frankly be opposed to having a board member be on the negotiations team or a city council person, but I am very supportive of the fact that our administration and those experts that we pay will do our bidding, and we must be very broad and very, very comprehensive in representing the community. Because this is one of those areas where you're not just representing the district, you're also representing the larger community. As city council must be forced to represent the larger community as well. So I think the next steps, to the point Mr. Davis made, I think we need to move with all deliberate speed that we possibly can to meet together. I know we're going to continue to talk about it in finance, and we'll continue to talk about it here. It's probably part of that dialogue the president's already outlined regarding our tax levy piece that we have to be talking about. So I think a lot of what we're talking about is going to be about us coming together with a larger strategy, not just plugging in numbers for the 99 agreement with new numbers, but thinking more broadly about what the next 10 years or so of the district might look like, which I think we've got some sense of where we want to be going. And I think that has to get plugged in, not just what is a negotiated item, but what's our vision and what do we want? We want to grow, and we want to have more neighborhood health, if you will, and wholesomeness and well-being. There are things that we are committed to in our strategic plan that should also guide what this 99 agreement needs to be. It's not just a financial document. So I would suggest that finance continue to talk about abatements, which it has been assigned, that we continue to talk about it, and that we create, with the help of the community already and continued community involvement, perhaps we create a large picture with great specifics that we can say to our administration, we need you to go and do this good fight and keep reporting back. That's their accountability to us. The other piece I would say is I do want a response not sent to the city necessarily, but I really appreciated the quick look-see of what the city sent to us and your early interpretation of what it meant. I'd really like to do what the treasurer recommended in the beginning of this meeting, which was for some of the data people in the city and the data people here to sit down and get these numbers straight to begin. There's no reason to negotiate until you have agreement on some of these baseline numbers, because that you just sit there and talk about spinning in the mud. So I think that the administration, if they could, get the answers back to us so that we have a companion piece to what the city sent to us, beyond even your wonderful presentation. If the data people can sit with the data people on both sides, it's not negotiations, but it's, you know, trying to get to the facts. And then we sit together, both finance and then the board, and say, this is our vision of what we want this 99 agreement to look like. And then we send these people in to do it. I don't mind, and I'm in total agreement with Mr. Messer, towards the end of this, it's always a good idea maybe to have a third-party facilitator. But the third-party facilitator cannot be paid by the business community. It's as simple as that. And it's nothing against them, but I'm sorry, that just doesn't make sense. So a third party that truly is a third party, I think is a good idea, but not, he who pays you.
Okay, we do want to go home tonight. Mr. Messer.
Yeah. You know, and I think, you know, to that point, you know, the idea of it being a board member, I was throwing that out there, thinking out loud, is that our superintendent has 60-plus schools to run and or open for this fall. Our legal counsel, full-time and then some, you know, I think that it's going to take more hands to be able to go out and benchmark and call other cities and find out what's working. I'd love to know, Cleveland, how did you do this? How did you negotiate? But this is gonna take people reaching out, and I don't think we can say, hey, in between meetings, can you add this to your plate because you got all these schools to open? So it just has to be either we're gonna dedicate somebody in the administration, but I think this is a team. It wasn't to exclude, I think definitely administration at the table, but the team has to be, I think, pretty broad because it is a lot of work. And I bet if you actually started to put a project plan together and calculate the hours, we're talking hundreds of hours to get to a point, if we did it right, where you're doing the analysis and benchmarking, et cetera. And I don't think we can just weave that in to our existing resources.
Ms. Bolton?
One last thing, usually, traditionally, in the negotiations, ultimately, the superintendent, you know, has the final say before us, and then we get to say it. But normally in negotiations, we don't send the superintendent into the room because there has to be somebody that is also separate from the team. So I think we need to say that it isn't necessarily going to be the superintendent sitting there, but it's the team that she and we decide is going to be there.
I think, okay, so in closing, I think what we can start with is develop this framework from the discussion tonight. We can share that with administration amongst ourselves. We probably need to talk about and, you know, narrow that scope a little bit. And we can do that as quickly as within the next couple of meetings. So what I am asking of board members is, we have a couple of very high priority board matters over the next couple of weeks. So I'm asking that when we issue out like requests for agenda items, please be considerate and not add more to the plate so we can deal with these things because they're the important things. How about that?
Great.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, or business? Okay, I forgot one thing. Ms. Dillingham, your information, do we have a copy of that? We want the recommendations, and also I never got my question answered about the 15 million. That would be helpful too, Mr. Mooney. If you could, real quickly, thank you.
Thanks. Let me start by saying I'm an attorney, not an accountant.
Okay.
Okay? So when we developed our proposal, we came up with, I guess you would say, a shopping list of things that we think you should consider in your negotiations with the city. And I don't think we had the expectation that you would agree to all of the items, and you might have some other ideas of your own. But we wanted kind of lay out a marker for saying, these are the types of things we think you ought to consider. In terms of the payment from the city, if that's the direction you're going to go in, you're getting $5 million now. When that agreement was negotiated, our guess is there were maybe $200 or $300 million of abatements out there. And the plan was this was going to compensate the school district going forward for the abatements that were then on the table and might be contemplated. And I think we all agree that, at least from the school board's point of view, and probably from the taxpayers' point of view, the abatements have blossomed, and now, as we learned yesterday, they total about $3.8 billion, about, as I said, 20% of the private property of the city. And so what do you and then even if you negotiate something that puts a lid on future abatements, targets them more so that we're trying to turn the faucet down on abatements going forward, what would be fair to compensate you for all the abatements already on the books? And I will defer to the accountants in the room to kind of make a better make-whole calculation than we did. But our assumption was the abatements are certainly 3, 4, 5 times what they were in '99 when you agreed on that $5 million amount. So that's really our thinking, but I would defer to somebody to make a better calculation. The bottom line is you can try to turn the spigot down in any agreement that you reach with the city so that this number doesn't keep getting bigger, bigger, and bigger in future years, but those $3.8 billion in abatements are on the books now. Many of them are going to last 10, 15, 30 more years.
Thank you.
That's what I'm thinking.
Thank you. Okay. Having no other business before us, I declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you.